evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome for our guest from Sri Lanka, the writer Shehan
We practiced this, come on.
I was rehearsing it, though. Excuse me.
That's all right.
Who just came from Turin.
My name has been mangled all over the world, it's okay.
It's just coming from Turin, where he had a book presentation. The Dutch version is out. The French version will come in January. The German version will come out November 28th. So very soon you can read it in German. With us, Komi Togbonou, a Berlin-based actor, singer, and musician. He has been working for theater, TV, and movie, radio, I heard before.
Yes.
And he will be reading the German passages of Shehan's novel.
Hello.
For your new novel, Shehan, you received last year's Booker Prize, 10 years after your first novel, Chinaman, The Legend of Pradeep Matthew, won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. So you kind of used to getting big prizes for your books.
So the next one's got to win the Nobel Prize or it's a failure. I guess.
You hope so.
Who knows?
The Seven Moons of Maali Almeida starts with a short quotation, "Father, forgive them, for I will never." And I have to talk a little bit about that because that frames the historical surrounding in which we enter with your novel. The quotation is of Richard de Souza, opens this first chapter, so to speak, the first moon, and looking up who he was, one is deeply confronted with Sri Lanka's history. The journalist, writer, and filmmaker had been killed by officials. At that time, until its defeat in 2009, the LTT, the Tigers of Tamil Eelam, insurgents in the north wanting to create an independent Tamil state, as well as the Lankan state and the Communist Party were involved in fierce battles, drugs, sales of weapons, extortion, terrorism. For the year 1990, Human Rights stated the LTT and the Sri Lankan security forces both carried out massacres of civilians. The army summarily executed suspect Tamil insurgents. The LTT did the same to Sri Lankan police officers. Both the LTTE and the security forces used civilians as shields against attacks. The army engaged in heavy bombing in civilian areas, resulting in damage to homes, hospitals, temples, churches, and pedestrians. Burning bodies appeared along roadsides in many parts of the country, and reports of mass arrests and disappearances increased. Quotation end. In the word of the novel, the government forces, the eastern separatists, the southern anarchists, and the northern peacekeepers are all prolific producers of corpses. This past, full of bloodshed, is one of the threads of the Seven Moons of Maali Almeida. There are many others besides crime and political history, political power games, social and economic upheavals. Love and friendship is one very important point. Sex also, gambling, and in a certain way also reconciliation, forgiveness, remembrance. Your main character, who finds himself dead, has been a photographer, Shehan, a war photographer, a photographer who was able to work in places others could not go. What motivated him?
What motivated him or me?
Him. You to create such a figure.
So I think one thing Maali Almeida and myself have in common is we grew up in the Colombo bubble. And so Colombo is the capital of Sri Lanka. You know, Sri Lanka is roughly shaped like a hand or a teardrop or a pearl, depending on which metaphor you want. Colombo's around here, and the war was happening up north, around the east. And I grew up, so I was a teenager during the time the novel is set, and I remember we pretended like the war was happening in another country. We lived in this bubble, and we watched cricket, drunk Iraq, and wrote novels and played in rock bands. And you still see the Colombo bubble in existence today when we have an economic crisis, but Colombo seems to carry on. And Maali Almeida was an interesting character for me because, yeah, I was just a teenager and we just sat living in that bubble, but this guy actually escaped the bubble and he went to these very dangerous places and photographed things. And yeah, I grappled with the idea what motivated him, and I think a number of factors. The first thing, he found something he was very good at. You know, he has daddy issues, and his dad told him he'd never be good at anything, and he found something. Yeah, he could go there and take that shot that no one else could take. And but also he was, and after what he saw, he was an atheist, a nihilist, and that's why he's quite flabbergasted to wake up in the afterlife and find out that he thought there was no system, there was no one presiding over this. And he finds that there is a system, but it's completely disorganized. It's like a Sri Lankan bureaucracy, and he has to navigate that. But I also think the fact that, I mean, the quote that you started with from Richard de Soysa, Richard de Soysa was the motivation because he was the most famous case of, I mean, I think, you know, journalists and activists going missing was something very common there, but Richard de Soysa's death really rocked especially liberal middle-class Colombo, because it told us that anyone, the state could come after anyone. And I think the book took 7 years to write, so Maali Almeida is very different from Richard de Soysa. He was a theater person, he was a filmmaker, an activist. Maali is a photographer and a gambler. But I think one thing they had in common, they were both closet gay men. And I think that was another motivation. Maali Almeida, I mean, in '89, even in liberal Colombo society, you couldn't be open about your sexuality. So I think that was another motivation. He went to these places because he could be himself there. But also he thought he was doing important work. He perhaps idealistically or naively believed that the photographs under his bed, which...
Right, the famous box under the bed.
The box under the bed. That if the world could see these photographs, then the Sri Lankan war would end and all wars would end, and this was his motivation.
That was one of those big searches he was going through in the 7...
Yeah, so he has 7 moons, 7 days. I'm going to talk about what the 7 days signify. But one thing is, yeah, so he's solving his own murder. He wants his photographs to be seen. And I think so. I think it was a mixture. What motivated him was a mixture of ego, a mixture of idealism, but also the ability that he could be himself in these strange places. And that's what. And also, I think, like Richard de Soysa, he thought he was invincible, and that's why he's absolutely surprised to find out that find himself murdered and in the afterlife.
Yeah. You said he was a gay man, sexually extremely active, a gambler. Does that put him on the edge of society? Is that, because you were mentioning that was one of the reasons why he went out in all these strange places?
Well, in a lot of ways, he was an insider because he was also, like, I didn't set out to write a political novel, even though when it came out, Sri Lanka was in collapse, so suddenly this has become a prescient novel. I thought I was writing a historical novel. Sorry, I lost the thread of the question. What was it?
I wanted to know whether the fact of being gay and being also a gambler.
Insider, outsider, yes.
Inside, outside.
So I think one thing so the detective story, the convention of the detective story is you have the corpse and you have several suspects. And so Maali Almeida, Almeida is a Burger name, it's a Portuguese name. And so he could speak Sinhalese and Tamil and English, and he could, so he worked with all the different factions, and it was a very complicated political time. You know, we had 3 wars going on. We had the separatist war, we had the Marxist insurrection, we had the Indian peacekeeping force, and he was in cahoots with all these different sides. And so this was useful for a murder mystery. There was many people who wanted him dead.
Yeah. Maybe we hear a first passage you read, and then we continue our conversation.
Sure. So this is a book full of demons and talking animals and ghosts and all of that, but I'm going to read you a passage where none of those things are there. This is really about the cops investigating the murder mystery. And I've been asked as well, my first book, Chinaman, which I was here 9 years ago talking about that it's been called a book about cricket, but I think it's a detective story. It's about a drunk journalist chasing a cricketer, and I think this is a detective story as well. And I've been asked, if you're writing detective stories, how come there's no detectives? How come it's only journalists? And the reason is, I think Sri Lanka's crimes, they don't get solved. We don't have Hercule Poirot twirling his mustache or Sherlock Holmes with his pipe solving the murder. Murders happen, there's many conspiracy theories, and in the end they end up unsolved. And I think the heroes of Sri Lanka, and perhaps this is true of South Asia, are the journalists. The journalists are the ones who go out seeking the truth and end up paying the highest price, some with their lives. So this is the bit about the cops. The neighborhood was called Kompanya Vidya by the Sinhalese and Komanu Teru by the Tamils, both meaning Company Street. The British called it Slave Island. These names persist today and provide unsubtle clues to how natives and colonizers viewed each other. The back of the Hotel Leo is an abandoned lot that serves as a rubbish dump for the neighborhood. The surrounding streets are crumbling buildings and slums. The crenellated rooftops are occupied by worried cats and bored bats. What he was here? Detective Kasim points to the dent in the garbage bags with the splatters of red. Kottu and Balal nod. You thought it was a drop-off? Sir, this building is a drop-off, says Kottu. You didn't think there was too much blood? Didn't think like that, sir. Kasim shines a torch up the walls of the hotel. It looked like brown and red paint had been thrown down its side. You didn't notice those stains? Sir, when collecting garbage, no time to look at scenery. Keep talking like that and you see what happens, snaps ASP Ranchagoda. From today, you will give full paperwork. Balal and Kottu are silent. Kasim shines his torch around the rest of the dump. The night has been one of bad smells. A breeze whizzes past him and makes him shiver. Detective Kasim turns to Kottu. He was thrown from one of those balconies, right? Not by us, right? Balal nods. Kottu coughs and looks away. So, where's the rest of the body? Kottu looks at Balal, who looks at his feet. It's gone, sir. So I'm supposed to give his mother some limbs, a shoulder, and I don't know what that is. How do we prove it's Maali Almeida? ASP Ranchagoda speaks up. If he was taken in before, his prints will be on file. Detective Kasim shakes his head. I trust our fingerprint department less than I trust you. Where's the head? Sir, we threw it in the lake. I don't want to hear it. Get me the head. I don't care if you have to drain the whole stinking Beira lake. We need it tonight. Kottu picks up the phone in the office and gets driver Malli out of bed. Detective Kasim lumbers towards the lift. What are we doing, detective? Asks ASP Ranchagoda once they are out of earshot. You better put in for overtime, Puta. Ranchagoda pauses outside the lift, but does not go in. Kasim gets inside and holds it with his finger. What's the issue? Boss, first you say you are transferring away from corpses, now you want to put in for overtime? We have a job to do. And what's our job? We protect the innocent, says Detective Kasim. I thought we protect the powerful. Do we need to discuss this now? Kasim takes his lift off the button, which causes the doors to close. He curses and sticks his arm out to block the lift's jaws. Boss, I'm confused about another thing. Get in the lift now. Are we investigating this, or are we covering this up? Thank you.
Thank you, Shehan. We protect the innocent, says Detective Kasim. And other parts in the book we hear, we don't take bribes, we don't bend laws. Are all those police officers cynical?
So this book went through multiple revisions all through the pandemic. The pandemic was a terrible time for the world, but it was not a bad time for writers, because most of us were stuck in a room full of, we all buy more books than we read, so we're stuck in rooms full of unread books and unfinished manuscripts. And so I ended up tinkering with this for 2 years. And my editor, bless her, Natanya Jans from Sort of Books, she said, she said your middle-class characters are reasonably well drawn out, but your working-class characters seem to be all the same. And, editors are very polite and kind. She was basically telling me that I'm a class snob, right? So we end up revising that. So I think so you have the garbage collectors, that's a euphemism, the guys who dispose of bodies, Kottu and Balal. One is a trained butcher, he knows how to cut up bodies and do it. The other one is a thief who says, I can't get a job anywhere, so I might as well do this, it pays better than, working in a butcher shop. And with the cops, so you have Kasim and Ranchagura. So one is by the book, he thinks he's doing worthy work, he thinks he's protecting the innocent, whereas the other is a cynic. He knows that the big boss is paying for them and they're there to cover up murders. So I think that was interesting for me, that revision, and I think that was a great note from Natanya to look at these different characters who are doing these terrible things, but they have different justifications for it. And I think, without giving too many spoilers, I think Kasim has his own arc, and so does Ranchagura. And when they're debating, what are we doing here? Are we covering this up or are we solving it? And towards the end, they kind of, have their conflict and they resolve it in their own way. I think Sri Lanka's civil war was a lot of so-called decent people doing terrible things and finding ways in themselves to justify it. Because one thing I found out, right at the beginning of the book, there's an abbreviation chapter which kind of, for Western readers, sums up all the complicated characters. And what I realized is, one thing is there's no good guys in this war. Maybe there's no good guys in any war. But none of the bad guys think they're bad guys. All of them think that they're doing something justified, and this was interesting to me.
Justifications are hilarious. We have already in the passage you've been reading, a mutilated corpse, and the dead person, Maali, has to undergo strange rituals. You were mentioning the bureaucratic registration office, that's a place full of dead, and then he has the 7 moons, the 7 nights, before he is definitely dead and gone. What are these 7 moons for?
So that is based on, the thing is this, I had to solve a lot of problems when researching this, because most ghost stories, you don't really meet the ghost till the final chapter or the 3rd act, and depending on the special effects budget of the film, it's a good film or a bad film, depending on how the ghost looks. But in this one, the ghost turns up on page 1 saying, "Hi, I'm a ghost." So I had to figure out, what do ghosts do all day when they're not being scary? What does the afterlife look like? What are the rules and all of this? So I started off, the 7 moons comes from Sri Lankan folklore and ritual, but I don't think it's Sri Lankan, because I've seen it in Singapore, around Asia. The idea that the corpse flutters around after death for 7 days. So on the 7th day, we all have a almsgiving, a blessing, so that the dead spirit can move to wherever they're going. And if you miss that bus, there's another almsgiving after 3 months, the Tunma Sadani, and that's 90 moons. If you miss that, I don't know what happens to you. You're doomed to. So that's where it began. But the problem is, I talked to, I researched the religious texts. I read Dante. I watched a lot of horror movies as well. I visited haunted houses.
Yeah, you had to, definitely, because there is some real bad monsters in it.
Yeah, there's lots of demons. But the thing is, nobody knows anything. Not the philosophers, not the religious figures, nobody knows anything. And you can't really interview a ghost unless you want to do a seance. But I wasn't that brave to do a seance. You know how that story ends, right? Novelist trying to research a book does a seance. We've seen that movie before. And so I used a lot of folklore, but I think you can see a lot of influence of horror movies as well. I was recently in Torino yesterday, and Dario Argento, Giallos were very much influenced. And I think in the demons, the Mahakali, it's based on Hindu mythology, but it also owes a lot to Clive Barker's Hellraiser. And in the end, I had to construct something that at least had logic by the book standards. And so I came up with the idea that the afterlife must resemble a Sri Lankan bureaucracy. We have this delusion that when we close our eyes for the last time and open them again, all will be revealed, and our life will make sense, and the secrets of the universe will come to us, which is nice it's comforting, but I just thought the Sri Lankan afterlife probably resembles a visa office, a Sri Lankan visa office, where you wake up and you've got a piece of paper and you've got to get it stamped at that office over there, but the guy's gone to lunch for the last 200 years, so you have to get your ears checked. And that confusion, it had comic absurdity to it, so that was an interesting opening scene, but it also makes sense that why should the afterlife make sense when life doesn't make sense? And so I borrowed from, all these philosophical sources as well, all these pulp sources, but there is a logic to it. So I think, again, Netanya said, because I had like 20 rules for ghosts. In the end, we boiled it down to 3. And the 3 were, you can go wherever your corpse has been. So you can only go where your corpse has been, which is why ghosts are either seen at cemeteries or at their homes, because otherwise the ghosts will go to the Maldives or the Bahamas and hang out. So you can only go where your corpse has been. You can travel with the wind. And the wind was important because I was writing this novel at 3 a.m. in the morning, and suddenly you're writing and a door slams and a wind blows and you think, why is there someone sitting behind me telling me this story? But the third rule, I think the most important, is you could only go wherever your name is spoken. And that was a useful device in a detective novel, because whenever someone mentions Maali Almeida, he gets to go there and say, and that was another suspect talking about him. But I think also it had a deeper meaning for me, because I think you die a second death when the last person on earth remembers your name. And that's why perhaps ghosts don't last more than 3 generations, because when you're forgotten on earth, then you're truly dead. But I'd like to say that this all came to me in a vision and I just wrote it down, but this was a long, 3-5 year process where the afterlife, but I think the afterlife as chaos made more sense to me than the afterlife of neat answers.
Someone who tries to keep order in this business is Dr. Rani, the woman with the clipboard. The narrator took her photo when she was shot, and now she has some sort of job in the registration. What's her role?
So again, Dr. Rani, so every ghost in this book is based on an unsolved murder of 1989-1990, and Dr. Rani was based on Dr. Rajini Thiranagama, who was a university lecturer in Jaffna in the north of Colombo. She was a Tamil moderate, and she was murdered by the Tamil Tigers. That's what extremists do, they murder the moderates. And then we have another figure, Sena, who was a campus Marxist based on Daya Patirana, who was one of the first, less well known than Richard or Rajani. And I think when I started thinking of this book, around 2012, 2013, the idea was, what if we could let Sri Lanka's dead speak? Because there's a lot of bickering, we've had a 30-year war, and for my generation, we thought the war would never end. And then in 2009, it finally ended, and we thought, okay, now the wounds can heal, we can move forward, we'll be unstoppable, because it's a beautiful country full of potential. But for 3-4 years, all there was bickering about how the war ended, how many civilians died, whose fault it was, who was to blame. And I thought, well, maybe let's let the dead speak. What would the victims of Sri Lanka's war have to say? Because the living clearly don't have a clue. What would they have to say? And so I think my initial idea was, what if Richard de Soisa, Dr. Rajini Thiranagama, and Daya Patrena met in the afterlife? What would they have to say to each other? But of course, the book took a long time, and these characters evolved, and they ended up being in conflict with each other.
So I think Komi Togbonou should read us some passage in German, please.
Sag meinen Namen. Du willst dem Universum dieselbe Frage stellen wie jeder andere. Warum werden wir geboren? Warum sterben wir? Warum muss überhaupt irgendetwas sein? Und das Universum braucht nichts zu antworten als, keine Ahnung, lass mich in Ruhe, du Arschloch. Das Leben nach dem Tod ist genauso verwirrend wie das Leben davor. Das Dazwischen ist genauso willkürlich wie das da unten. Also denken wir uns Geschichten aus, weil wir im Dunkeln Angst haben. Der Wind bringt deinen Namen und du folgst ihm durch Luft und Beton und Stahl. Du gleitest durch eine Gasse auf Slave Island und hörst das Flüstern aus jedem Eingang. Almeida, Melinda. Dann weht dich der Wind durch belebte Straßen Dehivelas und du hörst noch mehr Stimmen. JVPler, Aktivist, Almeida, Maali, vermisst. Von Slave Island nach Dahivilla in einem Atemzug, schneller als mit dem Hubschrauber. Immerhin hat der Tod dich vom Verkehr auf der Gore Road, den Fahrern auf der Parliament Road und den Kontrollpunkten an jeder Straße befreit. Du fährst vorüber an den Gesichtern nichtsahnender Leute, die durch Colombos schmutzige Straßen schlendern, die sterblichen Brüder und Schwestern der lieben Verblichenen und bald Vergessenen. Du bist ein Blatt im Sturm, im Sog einer Kraft, die du nicht kontrollieren kannst und der du dich nicht widersetzen kannst. Der sri-lankische Visionär Arthur C. Clarke hat mal gesagt, hinter jedem Lebenden stehen 30 Geister, denn so viel mehr Tote gibt es. Du siehst dich um und befürchtest, dass der große Autor das Verhältnis sogar noch unterschätzt hat. Hinter jedem, den du siehst, sitzt eine verlorene Seele. Über manchen schweben Schutzengel und wehren die Ghouls ab, die Pretas und Rahu und die Dämonen. Andere dagegen haben erlesene Exemplare aus den letzteren Gruppen vor sich, die ihnen Zweifel ins Gesicht zischen. Anderen hocken Teufeln auf den Schultern, die ihnen Galle ins Ohr speien. Sir Arthur hat 3 Jahrzehnte seines Lebens auf dieser verfluchten Insel verbracht und ist offensichtlich Sri Lanka. Die Österreicher haben die Welt davon überzeugt, dass Hitler Deutscher war, aber Mozart ihnen gehörte. Nach Jahrhunderten bewaffneter Plünderungen durch die Piraten aus London, Amsterdam und Lissabon dürfen wir Sri Lanka uns doch wohl wenigstens einen Sci-Fi-Visionär gönnen. Der Regen spuckt Blitze und der Donner lässt Winde fahren. Du weißt nicht mehr, wie oft es seit deinem unvorhergesehenen Ableben schon geregnet hat. Entweder ist der Monsun früh dran oder das Universum weint um dich und dein dummes kleines Leben. Heute fallen die Tränen dick wie Tintentropfen, stürzen sie aus wütenden Wolken auf die Köpfe der Sanftmütigen.
Thank you, Komi.
Thank you.
We have here a part which you use often in the novel, where Maali is talking, kind of talking to himself, talking to, in his head, talking to whom. That's a special form of presentation of the narration. We feel as the protagonist was talking to himself in a you form, and he's the one to whom he's talking. But what made you choose this approach, being closer in his head?
You mean the second person voice?
Person voice, yeah.
That was a big decision, and I started off writing it in the third person. It was a conventional ghost story with a ghost called Maali Almeida. I did in the first person as well. But again, this was problem solving. What does the afterlife look like? What do ghosts do? What does a ghost sound like? And I came to the conclusion that if anything survives the death of your body, it's perhaps the voice in your head. And the voice in my head is in the second person. I don't know about anyone else's heads, how your thoughts speak to you, but for me, it's almost like someone else speaking to me. And with writing, you don't think, you go by intuition and gut instinct, and so I just wrote it in the second person, the pages seemed to flow. But it's only later that I interrogated it, and because the you telling the story and the Maali Almeida in the flashbacks are slightly different voices. And if you've heard the audiobook by Shivanta Vijay Singh, and this is, I met him afterwards, I didn't meet him when he was recording this, but he narrates, the you narrating it and the Maali Almeida in the flashbacks are in a slightly different register, and this is, I thought, very clever of him. And
it's what you did.
Yeah, but I didn't tell him, but I think he got it.
Yeah.
And I think this is down to I suppose it's a Buddhist idea. We get it from now, mindfulness is quite trendy at the moment, and yeah, even myself, I have a meditation app that I plug in every morning. And the question is, who is the you? Who are you? Are you the person whispering your thoughts? Are you the person originating your thoughts? Or are you the person listening to these thoughts? Receiving these thoughts. And where do your thoughts come from? And he wonders this as well. And we've all wondered this. You do something and you think, what made me do that? What was I thinking? Why did I say that? And you believe that your thoughts come from you, but here the idea is perhaps there's a spirit sitting behind you whispering these bad ideas into your ear, and you are responding to them, and meditation's all about ignoring the voices and being your true self. Yeah, so that's why I used the second person. It just seemed to work, and also, yeah, I think, who is telling this story? Is it Maali, or is it his soul, or his conscience, or someone else? But all these justifications came afterwards. This is the benefit of revising a book over 7 years. You get to think of these things. But initially, I just thought the voice in my head is in the second person, so I'm going to write this in the second person.
I was wondering what this approach allowed you to do, language-wise, or also as far as memories are concerned. He knows more than he knows. Yeah, so it's... I think at the basic level, it's amnesia tale. I mean, it's a murder mystery and a detective story, but it's amnesia tale. He doesn't know how he was murdered. He doesn't, for suspense value, he doesn't know how he was murdered. He misremembers things, and he forgets how badly he treated the people who loved him. And I think that's the heart. You have a detective story and a political thriller, but I think the heart of the novel is the love triangle, and where he assesses how he treated his girlfriend and his boyfriend and his mother and his absent father, and he has to also make sense with how he led his life. And I suspect, unless we all live to a ripe old age, which I hope we all do, but I think when we pass on, if there is an afterlife, you'd be wondering, well, 55 years, what was that about? Or what was that for? What did I do? And so there's all that he's grappling with. You were already mentioning that cartoon and other things went into the novel, folkloristic tale, report, fantasy. But it is in large part a play with shadows, with our shadows, that are consciously or unconsciously living with us. You can call them however you want. You have an order of the underworld in your book: ghost, school, preta, devil, yaka, demon, monsters. But how much is this, because we are having a magical realism part in this festival, how much is this kind of magical realism?
So I think we have a session tomorrow about magical realism, so I'll save my big comments for that. But I didn't think I was writing magical realism. I thought I was writing a pretty conventional ghost story. Because when you talk about magical realism, you're putting yourself up there with Salman Rushdie and Bulgakov and Garcia Marquez and Bolaño and Günter Grass and Atwood. And look, I'm on my second novel. I can't really talk about myself in those terms. It was a ghost story, and therefore I had to figure out the rules. And I'm still a bit confused about what magical realism and fantasy versus, like, what's the difference between Margaret Atwood and Ursula Le Guin? They're both fine novelists, but they're on different sections of the bookshop.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the only conclusion I came to is that if there's a dragon in your book, it's a fantasy. But if the dragon is a Marxist, it's magical realism. That's the best I can come up with. But the thing is this, I'm happy to be anywhere in a bookshop, right? So if I'm with Stephen King and Neil Gaiman in the horror section, I'm happy with that. But yeah, if I'm rubbing shoulders with Rushdie, that's also fine. But I think what happened was I wrote this ghost story, and in the end, the original title for this was Chats with the Dead, and it was about ghosts, Maali Almeida going and interrogating all the victims of Sri Lanka's wars and chatting to them. And I think what happened was the ghosts ended up talking too much and rambling, and the ramblings got mistaken for profundity and literature, and then it got awarded a big prize. So now I'm in that section of the bookshop. But you don't really think about this when you're writing. You're sort of trying to be as authentic as possible and as honest as possible. But I'm happy to be anywhere in a bookshop, so that's fine. Yeah.
You should, definitely. You should. Do not be afraid of demons. It is the living we should fear. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Yes, so... And this book has got demons and hungry ghosts, and there's a lot of gruesome detail. But one thing now, my first book was about a drunk sports writer chasing a cricketer. And I presented it, Chinaman, at this very festival 9 years ago. And my audience used to be predominantly middle-aged men who were obsessed with cricket. I don't know what the score. Sri Lanka's playing India today. I think we're losing. I don't know. But now, since this book came out and won a big prize, my audience has expanded, and I get a lot of young people coming to, young Sri Lankans in Sri Lanka and around the world, coming to and getting books signed, and they tell me, these are kids born in the 90s, in the 2000s, that we're aware that there was a terrible war that happened in our country, but our parents don't talk about it. We're not taught about, schools teach about the ancient kings, the colonial period. They don't talk about recent history.
It's too recent. It's still too recent, don't you think?
Well, it's 40 years. It's not, the 89 is not, it seems like ancient history simply because Sri Lanka has been through so many catastrophes since then.
Yeah.
So 89, and that's why I felt safe writing about it, because I could have written about the end of the war, 2009, or I could have written about the Easter attacks, 2019, which is a hot topic at the moment, or the economic collapse and all of that, but I went that far back. But what I tell these kids is that don't come to this book for history. This could be your entry level, but Go and there's much better books about this. There's historical documents, and the real story is far more gruesome than anything in here. And I do believe that it's not ghosts we should fear. It is humans. It is humans acting, bad guys who think they are good guys acting with various agendas. These are the ones who should fill us with terror. And what humans are capable of is far worse than any horror movie you can watch. I mean, I love horror movies, but the ones that scare me are the realistic, are the true stories of history. That's what scares me. The Exorcist I love, but it doesn't really terrify me like reading reports about the massacres. You talked about the LTT massacres, the army massacres, and all of that. And again, these are unresolved. These are no longer talked about. And we talked about Amnesia Tale. I think, I've traveled around Southeast Asia. I think that's where my books play a lot. I think the first one, because it was about cricket, I had an audience in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. But everywhere I go, they say, we suffer from collective amnesia. We all live in different dystopias, and we don't address our past. And that's why this is my third visit to Berlin, and one thing that's always struck me is how Germany has been able to look at their past very soberly and confront it and scrutinizing and talk about it, which is something where we seem incapable of doing. It all, even to this day, talking about the war, talking about the end of the war, talking about the Easter attacks is controversial. People say, this is a privileged position, say, why talk about this stuff? You're just bringing up these things. Do you want them to happen again? But this is for people who have not suffered. The people who have suffered have unhealed wounds, and they need to talk about it. And I think that's a central tenet of the book, and that's something Maali is grappling with as well. How do we deal with our past? Do we bury it, forget about it? And that's what Dr. Rani is telling him. Your life is done, forget about it, walk into the light and move on. Where Sena, who's the darker character, says, no, that's exactly what they want you to think. There's no one giving us justice. We need to create our own justice. And I think Sri Lanka still grapples with that. And how do we deal with our past? And we've tended to forget it and move on to the next catastrophe. But I don't think that served us well. And I think during the pandemic, I was quite aware about how useless fiction writers are, how non-essential we are. But maybe this is something that we can contribute to, because you have conspiracy theories, you have varying historical accounts, and maybe the fiction writer can come in and maybe not even take a side, but just say these are the different ways we should talk about this stuff, for no other reason to ensure that it never ever happens again.
Yes. Komi, would you please read the second passage you prepared?
Okay. Und auf einmal verwandelt sich die Kälte in etwas Vertrautes. Oder nicht in etwas, sondern in das Fehlen von etwas. Eine Leere bis an den Horizont, in ein Nichts, das dich schon immer kennt. Als dein lieber Dada dahinschied, hast du jeden Abend beim Einschlafen verschiedene Szenarien durchgespielt. Vielleicht hatte er gespürt, dass du schwul warst. Vielleicht hatte er sich gewünscht, du wärst wie er. Vielleicht hattest du ihn an sie erinnert. Vielleicht hatte er sich erhofft, du würdest mehr Geld verdienen. Du hast noch einmal jedes übellaunige Wort nachempfunden, jeden gereizten Blick, jede Kränkung, jede Herabsetzung, bis deine Brust leer war. Du spürst sie, nicht wahr? Das ist die Energie. Die Leere und Verachtung waren nicht nur unangenehm. Die Verzweiflung fängt immer als Kleinigkeit an der du aus Langeweile knabberst, bevor sie zur Hauptmahlzeit 3-mal täglich wird. Wem wirfst du den ganzen Mist vor? Den Kolonisten, die uns jahrhundertelang gefickt haben? Oder den Supermächten, die uns heute ficken? Ein markerschütternder Schrei kommt von unten und das Dach spuckt schwarze Schatten, die der tote Priester wie mit einem großen Strohhalm aufsaugt. Wer hat uns gefickt? Die Portugiesen in Missionarstellung. Die Holländer haben uns von hinten genommen. Als die Briten kamen, waren wir sowieso schon auf Knien, die Hände hinter dem Rücken und den Mund offen. Ich bin ganz froh, dass die Briten uns kolonisiert haben, sagst du? Besser als von den Franzosen abgeschlachtet zu werden, sagt der Priester. Oder von den Belgiern versklavt. Oder von den Deutschen vergast. Oder von den Spaniern vergewaltigt. Manchmal, wenn ich über den Zustand des Landes nachdenke, überlege ich mir, ob es nicht besser wäre, sich von den Chinesen oder Japanern aufkaufen zu lassen, die Amis oder Sowjets unsere Gedanken kontrollieren zu lassen oder die Inder mit den Tamilen fertig werden zu lassen, wie wir die Holländer mit unserem Portugiesenproblem haben fertig werden lassen. Du sitzt jetzt in den Schatten und atmest das Nichts. Der tote Priester sitzt dir gegenüber und flüstert ins Dunkel. Diese Insel hatte immer schon ihre Verbindung. Wir haben Gewürze, Edelsteine und Sklaven mit Rom und Persien gehandelt, lang bevor Geschichtsbücher erfunden wurden. Auch unsere Menschen sind immer schon handelbar gewesen. Schau doch nur heute. Die Reichen schicken ihre Kinder nach London, die Armen schicken ihre Frauen nach Saudi-Arabien. Europäische Pädophile sonnen sich an unseren Stränden, kanadische Flüchtlinge finanzieren unseren Terror. Israelische Panzer töten unsere Jugend und japanisches Salz vergiftet unser Essen. In dem Moment wird dir klar, dass du irgendwo sein musst, aber nicht hier. Und dass du vergessen wirst, warum du gekommen bist, wenn du bleibst. Die Briten verkaufen uns Waffen und die Amerikaner bilden unsere Folterknechte aus. Welche Chance hat da jeder Einzelne von uns? Die Kreatur ist muskulös geworden und schleicht beim Reden auf dich zu. Ihre Stimme verdoppelt, verdreifacht und vervielfacht ihre Lautstärke. Du kennst diesen Gang und das Knurren. Du löst dich aus dem Schatten, aber das Wesen versperrt dir den Weg. Die Briten haben uns eine unpolierte Perle hinterlassen und wir schaufeln sie seit 40 Jahren mit Dreck zu. Das Wesen hat jetzt sein Gesicht direkt vor deinem und du bist dir nicht mehr sicher, ob es Männlein oder Weiblein ist. Du bist durchdrungen von der Kälte und dem leeren Tosen. Seine Augen bestehen aus 1000 anderen Augen und ihre Stimme aus 1000 anderen Stimmen. Dieses Summen am Rande der Hörbarkeit stammt weder von einer Sie noch von einem Er oder einem Es oder einer Vielzahl. Es ist eine Kakophonie. Hier kommt die stinkende Wahrheit. Atme tief ein. Wir haben es alles selbst in die Scheiße geritten. Maha Kalis Arme haben sich um dich gelegt, auch die Arme von jemand anderem und die von allen. Sag das nochmal, lauter und langsamer. Die Zähne des Wesens sind schwarz wie seine Augen. Und als sich sein Mund weitet, siehst du die schwarze Zunge und die Augen, die aus dem Hals starren. Wir haben alles in die Scheiße geritten. Ganz alleine.
Die deutsche Übersetzung aus dem Englischen ist übrigens von Hannes Meyer, von dem können Sie auch dann das ganze Buch auf Deutsch lesen. Appears the colonial past, but not as an explication of the actual situation in the 90s, and yet the colonial past is there.
It is, but so I can say this. I don't think anyone else can say this. But every time something happens, from the recent Easter attacks and allegations, human rights violations, all that, the common phrase is it's a foreign conspiracy. It's a foreign conspiracy to destabilize the sovereign nation of Sri Lanka. And this gets touted all the time. And even when we asked to look soberly at the crimes of the war, the pushback is very harsh. It's like, well, who are the Americans to tell us about human rights? Who are the British to tell us about human rights? And, this is whataboutery, and, it may be a fair argument, but I just always believed that for our nation's soul, we should be scrutinizing it, and we should be talking about it, not to put people in jail or whatever, but just to understand the terrible things we did to each other. And this is the demon talking, it's not me talking, but the demon says, at the time of the novel, we were 40 years old. Now we're 70 years old. And you can lay the blame elsewhere, but you have to accept responsibility. Ceylon in the 1950s and 60s was a beautiful place full of potential, and there's this perhaps apocryphal story that Lee Kuan Yew came in the 1950s to Ceylon and said, I want to build Singapore to look just like Ceylon. And, now it's a punchline to a joke, because where is Singapore and where is Sri Lanka? And I think, you can lay blame at the colonizers, and there's much to blame there, but in the end, we need to take responsibility and accept responsibility. And
as an adult attitude.
Yeah.
I said before that Maali's search has to do with memory and with trying to figure out not only his own death, but what things meant. But in the end, the novel is also about forgetting, isn't it?
Well, no spoilers, please.
All of them will read it anyhow.
So I think, look, Maali's not a very likable character. This is one thing Natanya told me. Can we make him a bit more likable? And I tried my best. I'm not sure I'd want to sit and have a drink with Maali Almeida. The narrator of my first book, Chinaman, W.G. Karunatilaka, I'll be happy to watch cricket and drink arak with him. He seems a lot of fun. And this guy, he was very self-centered, this sense of righteousness that he was doing this important job and all of that. But again, without any spoilers, I think he does have an arc. He does have an arc where he does things that are selfless. He puts himself in jeopardy for the people he loves. And towards the end there is, because I was always wondering how is this is why the book took so long. I think there are two types of writers, right? There are architects and gardeners. So architects sit there and they plot the book out and they have a detailed plan and then they start writing. I think most thriller writers, that's how Lee Child churns out a Jack Reacher book every year. They have that plan and they hit it. And I've tried that, but every time I just veer off the plan because the ghosts keep talking to me and telling me different stories. So the other approach is the gardener, where you don't know how it's going to resolve. You just plant a few seeds, and you can only see 3 chapters ahead. And so I didn't know how it was going to end. I didn't know what the resolution was. But I was always thinking, because this is set in '89, and he has all these hopes that his photographs are going to end wars and all of that. But the reality, as the readers would know, is the war continued for another 2 decades. And he believes, like I think he mentions that I want my photographs to be like the naked napalm girl, what the naked napalm girl did for Vietnam, that photograph. And that photograph, it didn't end the war, yeah. It won a Pulitzer for the photographer, but the war went on for another 6 years. And I've been confronted with this question, traveling, talking, especially in India. Do you think art, literature, books can end wars? And, you know, you'd like to think so, but Leo Tolstoy wrote War and Peace 100 years ago. It's a better novel than any of us could ever write. It's a classic. But it didn't do a great job of keeping Russia out of wars for the next century, did it? And so his idea that photography bearing witness can stop things, yeah, again, no spoilers, but I think he makes because the war continues, so in the end, what happens to his quest, he sort of makes peace with that and moves on. So there's a semblance of it. There's a lot of gruesome, there's bodies being chopped up, and there's a lot of horrible stuff. But I think it does end on a note of hope. And
Sweetness.
Yeah, maybe sweetness, yeah, maybe a happy ending. I'd like to think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shehan, Karunatilaka, I thank you very much. I thank you, Komi Togbonou, for reading. I thank you for listening, for laughing, for being with us here. And Shehan will be signing books outside at the book table, at Dussmann's book table. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shehan. Thank you very much. Thank you.